Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner. We're talking about a recent release today, and that is Dragon Rider by Taran Mathari. So this came out on April 23rd of this year, and this is a high fantasy epic coming in at 565 pages long. And this is my second Taran Matharu novel. It's also the start of a series, so is it any good? As always, we shall talk about the story, the characters, the world building, and the presentation before I give you my personal thoughts at the end. So let's just dive right in. So this is kind of a self-discovery story for your main character of Jai. Now, the other thing is this has a number of fancy tropes in there. Jai is of royal blood. Specifically, he is the third son of the former High Chief of the Great Steppe. And following a war between the Great Steppe and the Sabine Empire, which the Sabine Empire won, one of the terms of the peace treaty was that all children of the ruling tribe members would serve the Sabine in some way until the age of, I think it's 20. Jai is the third son, so not really in line to become a tribal chief or anything like that. And his job is basically to be the personal assistant and carer to the former emperor who was in charge when that war was fought. And there was a great deal of racism and cultural bias against the steppe people within the court as well. You then have other things going on. So you have political marriages of convenience, specifically with the Dansk at the north, who are very Nordic inspired in many regards. They come from a frozen tundra. They have magical dragons. Now, this is important because one of the key things in this is that the Sabines don't know how you magically bond dragons, and we'll talk on that a little bit more when we hit the world building later on. But as many things are, we establish the status quo, and then you throw it into disarray. In this case, you have a coup where the emperor is killed, the princess of the Dansk is captured, a number of the dragons are killed, and Jai just about manages to get away with the surprising help of the former emperor who had stepped away many years previously and was very much in his dotage at this point. And you have him going through finding the corpse of a dragon and discovering a dragon egg and accidentally bonding with this egg. This is something that's very unique. On his travels to try and get away, he runs into the former handmaiden of the queen, princess, I should say, and they make a deal to head in more or less the same direction, watch each other's back, especially because he has been bonded to this dragon, and this is something that doesn't happen. You have them trying to survive on their travels to get to safety, which obviously goes wrong until a mysterious stranger steps in and kind of saves them. And then you have what I like to call the training montage. You have a large period of the book where Jai gets to understand how his bond works and how magic works, and he learns how to use his magic as well and how to increase his abilities. And we don't get a huge amount of information about this mysterious character. Very rough, very ready, obviously has some sort of history within the world, which is revealed by the end of the book. And then obviously it all goes wrong as they get captured, as is always the way, and then they have to find a way to break out and rise to the moment to be the hero of the story before the book ends, with a cliffhanger going into book 2, and that cliffhanger being Jai finding his way basically to the Great Steppe and finding some of his kinsmen and basically claiming his right to the throne. So a number of tropes here. Overall, it does a decent job. Now, this is quite a slow-paced book, and a lot of this is setting up the world, and a lot of it is the training montage, so to speak. But it is very well done, and these are tropes for a reason. They do work, especially within a fantasy environment, and there is plenty of room in here for the story to breathe. So overall, this is a solid if relatively predictable plot. On to characters then. I'm going to touch on a couple of the side characters first. You have the royal family of the Sabines. The primary one that we spend any time with is former Emperor Leonid, who was the emperor at the time of the wars that Jai is serving. And whilst it's unfair to say that he took Jai under his wing, he was, whilst not as excessively cruel, he was certainly not kind. But there's an impression given that he tried to teach Jai a number of things and prepare him for the future. And you get a sense that there was a great deal of respect for Jai's father, as well as potentially the only person who ever really defeated him on the battlefield. You then have the two sons, one of which who is the current emperor and the younger one. Obviously, at least one of those doesn't make it out alive. You also have the head of the Griffin Riders, who are very much the elite magical guard of the Empire as well, called Magnus. There's some bits and pieces on there, but he is basically a very, very unsavory character. Very coarse, very violent, incredibly racist and sexist as well. And this is where you begin to get a sense of how dark the world is when you start to see some of the interactions between him and some of the royal family. On top of that, you then have the Queen and the Handmaiden. The Handmaiden is the main one we spend any time with, Princess, not Queen, who's called Frida. And she's an interesting character, and you spend a lot of the book with her. She's unusual in that she did have a bond, specifically with the dragon, and it's explained why she had that bond, and she has some secrets going on in the background as well. But she has control of her magic, but not as much as she thinks she does. And this becomes clear when you meet another character later on, who is the mysterious stranger and sort of training mentor, who explains that people think that this is the level, but actually it's further. And you can genuinely tell that there's some history between this character and, first of all, Leonid, as well as the Sabine in general. This is somebody who clearly knows what he's talking about and is far more powerful than he's made out to be, but also personally not in a great place. And he has a really interesting character arc. Again, not particularly likable though. Very coarse, very rough and ready. Very some of the language in here is very unexpectedly harsh with some of the word choices. The C word is used quite a number of times by a number of characters in particular, which is worth bearing in mind. Of course, the other character we have is Jai and his dragon, who is called Winter. And obviously, during the book, the dragon is a very minor character, but the interesting way they interact in terms of the bond that they develop, and it's very much an unspoken bond, but you also have this sense of disappointment and pride and affection towards each other that really does build and feed into each other, which is actually quite interestingly done. It's nothing we haven't seen elsewhere, but it's solidly done here as they begin to experience each other's emotions and get to sort of integrate, for want of a better word. Jai is shown to be quite clever and manipulative, and he is the main point of view. Well, he is the only point of view character through the book. He loves his brothers, his older brothers. He is very smart. He's well read. It's clear that he's been taken a little bit under Leonid's wing and taught a number of different things. And he has dreams of being a Griffin Rider, which realistically, because of his background, is very, very unlikely. He has very little knowledge of his homeland, but he's very quick thinking, and this is shown on a number of occasions where he's in situations where he has to talk himself and think quickly on his feet. He also feels a sense of despair, especially after the coup has happened and the various things he's seen, where you get a sense of him being overwhelmed because he's having to run back to his homeland, which he doesn't really know, and almost a sense of listlessness, and the only thing that pulls him through is his relationship to Winter, and it is particularly well done. And he does have a number of other interesting connections within the book as well. The other thing that's quite interesting is the way he sort of dovetails with his relationship with both Frida and the trainer as the story goes on. And there's definitely some romantic suggestions towards Frida in particular, although nothing is particularly looked at in any real detail in here. And it is very much a case of this is a 17-year-old boy who is suffering some yearnings, shall we say. And that's an interesting thing to look at. In many ways, this book reads, actually, in terms of some of the characters, a lot closer to a younger fantasy rather than what I class as general high fantasy. And I think that's quite interesting. That does come through on the writing. But overall, The characters are interesting enough, they have sensible character journeys. So overall, the character work is reasonably solid. So where this lands for me is the world building. And first of all, the book has a map which we'll show in presentation in a bit. But there's a lot of time spent within the training montage. And that gives you a great deal of explanation for how the magic system works in this world. And it is actually quite interesting with the idea of not everybody can bond with animals, first of all. The level of animal or type of animal you can bond with is sort of based on your own potential, and you can actually grow that potential as well. And how basically you recharge your magic is really interestingly done here, and the different sort of levels of magic, which are clearly called levels in here, which is an interesting choice, is quite well done. On top of that, you do have a lot of politics going on. You have a number of different nations sort of surrounding the Sabine. The main ones being the Dansk, who are the very much Nordic-inspired people from the north who have the dragons, who were going to be part of the arranged marriage. You have the Great Steppe, who are very much seen as uncivilized, almost barbarians, due to the fact they don't have any sort of set rule. It's a group of tribes. At the start of the book, they are busy wiping out a group called the Huddites. You've got religions that are mentioned. So there is a lot of political stuff going on here as well. And it does actually look at the living arrangements of a lot of the normal people and how they're dealt with by the militia, and how the trade roads run. And whilst it doesn't go in a great deal of detail on a lot of this, it does a really good job of fleshing out the world in a way that a lot of fantasy books actually don't anymore. And it's really, really appreciated. You don't really get any great big sweeping descriptions of what places look like. So in terms of, for example, the Sabine Palace, what you do find out is that this entire city is built just to basically house the royalty, which I find really, really interesting and does have historical precedence. We don't get a great deal of description about what it looks like, beyond the cramped, confined natures of some areas and the vast sort of open plains that sit beyond, so you can see armies coming from miles away, which is an interesting point to do with defensibility. So there is a lot of very, very good world building here. And this then leaks into some of the, not so much myths, but the more magical creatures of the world, where you do have kind of a hierarchy going on there as well. And it is all really, really well done. This is all aided by the map, which I'll show in a moment. But overall, I think probably the highlight of the book for me is the world building. Presentation then. This is a mixed bag. So we're going to start off with the cover, which you can see the UK cover on screen, which I've got it here. I'll put the American cover on screen as well, so you can be disappointed by it, because the UK cover is clearly a lot better. But this has a very good map, and I like maps in books, especially in my fantasy books, and this is a good map which gives you a good idea of the world space that we're operating within. And because of the way the text is, it does explain how long the distances are from where they're starting to where they're trying to get to, which gives you an idea of how far it is, which I appreciate, because quite often what you get in a lot of fantasy books is they go on a journey, but you don't really get a sense of how long that journey is. This does a good job of explaining how long that journey is. In terms of pacing, I actually think this is reasonably well paced. It is quite slow in many regards, although that's not to say that it's boring, because it isn't. What is interesting about that is that this is a slow-paced book with very small chapters. The average chapter length in here is about 5.5 pages, which feels very low for fantasy. And this causes me a few issues, because the way I read, if I start a chapter and finish a chapter, that is a stop point. It throws me out of the flow, because that's just how I read. And if you're then taking up with no real change to the status quo or no real jump in time or location, I don't understand why it couldn't just be the one chapter, and it kept breaking my flow of reading the story. And it's more noticeable in the first 120 pages. As it gets further into the book, when you have these chapter breaks, the next one starts either the next day or in a slightly different location further down the road. Again, it does touch on a load of tropes as well, and it does most of them very well. I do like the sort of training montage in here, as I'm calling it, quite a lot. It does a really good job of explaining magic and the world, and I really appreciated that. As somebody who likes to know the rules of the world that I'm reading, loved that. Absolutely adored it. The other thing worth mentioning, though, is that especially in the first quarter of the book, some of the word choice is interesting for some of the characters. So whilst I get that Jai is meant to be a young man, 16, 17, 18 years old, occasionally some of his thought processes or some of his wording in certain situations don't seem to fit his character. And what I mean by that is this is someone who's been brought up very much around royalty. He doesn't really have many friends within the other servants, so on and so forth. So some of the language that he uses, some of the terms he uses, feels very childish at times. And the problem you have with that is quite often it will come pretty close to something that is incredibly gruesome and horrific. And it gives you this kind of whiplash effect. Now, fortunately, that does fall away. And whilst there are still quite juvenile moments later on in the book with him, they make more sense in the way that they are written. They are not written in a way that I would say feels childish. I also mentioned that there is cussing in this book, and there is a fair amount in here. And again, this gets better as the book goes on in its usage. There are a few occasions early on where cussing is used by certain characters that doesn't really make sense for their standing in the world, and it felt a little bit like trying to be edgy quite early on. Later on, it didn't bother me as much because of the characters that we're using it, and it made more sense for those characters. But it did take me out. It made the first 130 pages of this a far more difficult read than it needed to be. Now, on saying that, this does have a very good natural progression to it in terms of the way it's plotted and paced out. And you do have very much a number of different acts. You have the status quo, to the escape, to the travel, to the capture, to the finale. And the travel is like the training montage and the learning about magic and establishing the rules point, which is probably the biggest part of the book. And it does a good job of punctuating these with brief moments of excitement and some decent action scenes as well. So overall, it's a bit of an uneven mix. It gets considerably better the further in it goes. However, I do hate short chapters. I do. But that is something for me personally. I know a lot of people prefer them. So a mixed bag, amazing cover, amazing map, good use of language after the first quarter of the book, and decently plotted. So overall, I'd say this is a win on its presentation front. Overall thoughts then, and at the end of the day, I actually did enjoy this book. It was a rough start though, and there's a number of reasons for that. The chapter breaks didn't really need to be there as much and broke up my reading flow early on. And some of the early writing felt very, very juvenile and I'd say middle grade in many regards, but middle grade with swearing thrown in. And it was trying to be edgier than it needed to be. Once that settled down and everything became more sensible and more relevant to the characters that were involved, then this was actually really, really good. It's a really engaging world with some strong character work, some really good relationships as well. Got an interesting magic system that is well fleshed out. You get a good sense of how big the world is and the politics of the world as well. And on top of that, there are a couple of twists in here. Now, on the flip side of all that, nothing in here is exceptionally original. There's stuff you will have seen, well, most of it you will have seen elsewhere, including the twist. If you've read plenty of fantasy, you will suss out the twists very early on, even though the reveal is quite late. But I enjoyed this. I think it's a beautiful cover as well, which is always a bonus. I love the map. I just wish that the chapters were given more time to breathe at times. So overall, I gave this a 3.75 stars out of 5. But I would love to know if you've read this, what your thoughts are. Let me know in the comments. I'll catch you all soon.